Hey there, everyone. Welcome to World History. This is human footprint specifically. Um, if you're not really sure what this whole footprint situation is about, we're not literally going to be looking at any footprints, but we are looking at metaphorical footprints, the steps, the path that mankind has taken over the centuries or over the thousands of years of human history. Um, we'll be tracking the steps that we've made to get us to where we are at today. All right. So we're looking at agriculture to start with, which I know that not everyone thinks that that's the most exciting thing on earth, but we're starting with that because that sets the foundation. It kind of sets the stage for everything that comes after, with all the innovations and advancements that come after that. Um, we'll look at those innovations. We'll see where they got us to. We'll see why people moved to different parts of the world. What happened when we settled the different regions of this planet. We'll see how cities eventually formed and major urban centers um, transformed kind of the entire way that this world operates. I mean, we went from 1 billion people in the year 1800 to 7 billion just 200 years later. And for the tens of thousands of years before that, we hadn't hit our first billion. So, I mean, our population has kind of done one of these. It's just gone through the roof. So, what has caused that sort of phenomenon? Okay. What I want us to look at with just this introductory video and introductory set of Google Slides, um, we're going to be covering in this, it's a pre-unit, all right? So this is the beginning, the introduction to the course. For the next few days, we'll be looking at the main elements of doing history. What does it mean to analyze history? So we're going to be looking at, to start with here, what is history? We'll back it up all the way to the most basic, right? History is basically our combined knowledge of all people, places, events, and advancements that took place in the past. Doesn't really matter how long ago that was. The past was tens of thousands of years ago. The past was yesterday. And the past was everywhere in between. Okay? Obviously, it's impossible to know everything, it's impossible to learn everything, and therefore it's impossible to teach everything. So we do have to pick and choose, right? Every history class, every historian, every book, every website has to decide what's important enough to remember, and then how are we going to remember it, and how are we going to convey that information. So, right, depending on who is writing the history, there could be a different purpose, right, a different intent, a different view or perspective, right? How I write something or how I teach something could be done differently than somebody else with a different viewpoint or a different opinion, okay? So throughout this class and throughout all my teaching, I try not to let any of my opinions or personal biases get in the way, right? I don't want you to think that I'm ever trying to get you to think one way or the other. All I want is for you to think openly, to have an open mind, to learn more, um, rather than having a closed mindset where you're not willing to learn anything, right? So, a couple of key things here, right? Where do we get our information about the past, right? I know teachers teach you things, but we have to get taught by someone, and usually the people that teach us or the resources that we learn from as teachers, that had to have come from somewhere at some point too. So we get information in a variety of different ways, right? It could be things that were written down over time. It could be visual evidence, photos and videos and paintings, art that we might see. It could be verbal evidence, so it could be interviews, it could be stories and tales that were told and passed down throughout generations. Um, and it could also be physical evidence. Sometimes is the most fun kind of evidence because it's the physical, tangible things, artifacts, sculptures, buildings, the places that we can visit. Um, I've been all over the world, and there's so many cool historical things that I've gotten the chance to see and to be present at. It's cool to see in person the Great Wall of China. It's cool to see some of these locations in southern Africa where um, early early people used to live and the things that they left behind. I mean, no matter where in the world you go, there's remnants of things that are left behind that are preserved that can teach us a whole bunch about our past. And when I say our, I mean us as mankind, as people, as humanity, right? We're ultimately all connected. We ultimately all came from the same root origin many, many years ago. So we're all more connected than sometimes we think we are, right? So there's two key things that I really want you to take away. This is gonna be coming up a lot in this class. It's gonna come up a lot at the beginning of the course, um, but we're gonna be looking at what are called primary and secondary sources. You've probably heard the term before. Some of you could probably teach the class right now about what the difference is between primary and secondary sources. Some of you might not know the first thing about them. So let me give you just a really quick overview. Um, a primary source is any sort of information that comes directly from the time period that we're studying. Okay, it is a first-hand account, right? A story, a handwritten document, an artifact, an object, something that was actually from the time period that we're taking a look at, right? Um, it could be diaries, it could be letters, it could be documents, it could be a newspaper from the time period, um, and even things that don't contain like words and text can tell us a lot about the past. So if I went to an old um, house that was built 500 years ago, or if I went to an ancient um, you know site where they have pyramids or something that were constructed 4 or 5 thousand years ago, right? Well, that building's not going to speak to me, but it can tell me a lot about what that civilization or that time period was like. Okay, it's like an eyewitness to that time period. Okay. On the other hand, you have what are called secondary sources. Okay, it's secondhand information. It's somebody or something that heard it from somebody who lived through it, meaning it was analyzed by someone else. It's been changed up over the years. It's information that you didn't get directly from the source. Okay, so your textbooks, if you ever have textbooks in your classes, right? You open that thing up. Um, that is people telling you about the past, but they didn't live through it, right? The guy who or woman or whoever wrote the textbook for a world history class, I'm sorry, but they weren't around when the Egyptians were constructing the Great Pyramids at Giza, right? They just weren't. So they have to get their information from somewhere else. Okay, um, I was not around during World War II, believe it or not, right? Um, I'm not that old. I did not live through World War II, and so I can teach you about World War II, but I would not be a primary source. And in fact, if somebody, my grandma was alive during World War II, but she wasn't involved in the war, and so she wouldn't be able to serve as a primary source about World War II, like the war itself. She could serve as a primary source, like a firsthand account of what it was like to live in the United States as a child during World War II. That she could serve as a primary source, but she could not serve as a primary source about something that she did not physically witness. Okay. Um, Wikipedia, it's a secondary source as well, right? So those are kind of the differences between primary and secondary sources. It's very important to understand the difference. Um, there is no better or worse, right? A primary source, a lot of times people are like, oh, well, that must be better because you're hearing it directly from someone who was living through it. And that's true, but they also might have their own slant to it. They might not be just giving you the facts, they might be giving their opinions. Okay? So something that I experienced and lived through, I can tell you with great detail what happened, but I'm coming at it from a different perspective than someone else. So sometimes it's good to have secondary sources instead because they've gathered the information, they've heard it from this side and they've heard it from this side, and they put it together and boom, they have a secondhand account of the information. Okay? And this kind of also gets at the idea of choosing good sources, right? Choosing sources that are going to be helpful for whatever purpose you are. Um, if you're writing about something or trying to learn about something, you want to get information that is reliable, that's consistent, that's accurate, that doesn't just contain what's called bias. Another word for bias is, I mean, like your perspective or opinion, right? If I try to convince you that my way of thinking is correct because I have a personal preference for that thing, that is that is my bias. Okay, so it's slanted one way or another. All right. Um, in the past, people have tried to say, dropping the atomic bombs um, on Japan back during World War II was the right thing to do. Okay. And then there are other people who say, no, that was horrible. Tens of thousands of people were killed in that. There could have been a better way to end the war, et cetera, et cetera. Those are bias, right? If I have an opinion and I want you to side with my opinion, that is bias. Okay. On the other hand, we have the opposite, basically credible. It's just accurate information. It's just facts. It's nothing beyond factual information. The goal is not to get you to believe my side is best and that your side is worse. My only goal is to get the information to you. Okay? Um, so I have some examples of bias, things that you might not realize are bias, but I have some real life situations, and so just take a look through here real quick. Your uncle is on Facebook and he posts an article and he is trying to get everyone to side with his point of view. He could still use facts, he could use statistics, he could use quotes, but he might be using them out of context or he might be manipulating them to try and prove a point. Okay, it means he's injecting bias. Okay. Number two, a foreign country's president really wants to pass a law because that president knows it's going to personally benefit him. He tries to convince the people that he's doing it to benefit them, right? Tricky, tricky. So he comes up with data that only supports his point of view, and the people latch onto his ideas and are like, oh yeah, that must be accurate. Okay, again, bias. Number three, your best friend got a failing grade in a teacher's class. Crazy, right? She decides that she's going to convince you that that teacher is garbage. You should never take that teacher. They're the worst. Okay? They had a personal experience that was negative with that teacher, so therefore she thinks that that teacher must just be across the map a bad teacher or a bad person, right? You've never met this teacher. You didn't have an opinion ahead of time, but now because your friend has only given you facts to support her side of view, you're going to be pulled towards believing that side of the story, right? Someone else might think that teacher is the best teacher in the entire world, right? That's bias too. It's bias on the opposite end of things, okay? So if you just kind of weigh both sides of the story and form your own opinion, that's great. But otherwise, it's considered bias. And then number four, you know that you want, and by the way, I don't have an opinion about this one, but you know that you want to buy a PS5 instead of an Xbox Series X. So you go to Google and you type in why the new Xbox sucks. Okay. Well, what did you just do? You made sure that the search results are agreeing with your side of the story, right? People do that all the time. You look for what you want to see. Okay. So you're going to find articles that trash on the Xbox because that's what you wanted to see in the first place, right? I was weighing whether to get an iPhone or an Android, a Google Pixel, a couple of weeks back, and one of my friends he's always owned iPhones, and so he keeps sending me articles that show why the iPhone is the better or superior choice. Well, that's bias right there, right? It might very well be the better phone, but it's subjective, right? There's no way to prove conclusively that it is the better phone. So bias happens everywhere. It happens in our modern world a lot. It happens on Facebook and social media a ton. But when we're looking at historical sources, you want to make sure that you have information that is just fact-based. So you are going to be using this information from these slides in the upcoming couple of days and a couple of assignments. So just make sure that you are kind of understanding these things. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer them. So take care.